So my talk today, I came up with this topic a little while ago, and when I was considering doing it, I was trying to figure out whether or not it made sense to have a different topic for today, but it was very hard to prepare. One thing that got me thinking this might be worthwhile speaking about the topic of what is humanism is that when I read in the paper earlier this week, a number of um, fundamentalist evangelical preachers blaming the COVID virus on our immoral behavior. One particular Florida preacher, Rich Wiles, said that that Jewish people got the coronavirus because they didn't embrace Jesus as the Son of God. One of Trump's own faith advisors, Ralph Drollinger, said that we are now experiencing the consequential wrath of God. Um, I spoke a couple of weeks ago about 7 deadly sins, and there are a number of reasons why we don't accept as humanists concepts of sin or concepts of divine retribution, and that is, in a way, it gets human beings off the hook for doing what we need to do in times of crisis. So I'm trying to live my humanist values during the COVID crisis. I'm thinking about you and your friends and family and hoping that everyone is healthy and safe. And if our people are struggling with the COVID virus, and certainly we're all struggling with our isolation, to try to go back to the values that you embrace in humanism, the values of believing in the inherent worth of every individual, believing in the importance of ethical relationships, and how we use those 2 elements to help build social justice. I am continually thankful for having the resources to be able to survive this when so many people in Philadelphia and around the world do not have the resources in order to make it through this COVID virus safely. So trying to be grateful every day is a big part of my humanism. Now I'm going to do a deep dive into humanism, and I was practicing it this morning and saying there's no way I can hold people's attention via Zoom for a half an hour. I'm going to try. I'm probably going to go off script. I'll probably throw some things out as I move along, but hopefully it'll be useful to you in explaining to your friends what humanism is. First of all, I want to say it is an umbrella term. It's used for a lot of different things, and it depends on the time it's being used and the context it's being used. Its meaning has evolved. I'm not claiming to have exclusive ownership of the meaning, but I'll try to address what I mean by it. Where I'm going to end up, so you know where the conclusion, where we're going to, is to basically say that I think that the essence of ethical humanism, our brand of humanism, is that we focus most on deed rather than creed, that we care more about how we treat each other than whether or not people believe what we believe about the reality of the world. I think another important factor that will be throughout my talk is the importance of reason. I think by sharing what we see about the world and by thinking rationally, we can come to ways to protect ourselves collectively best. I think it's too bad that in our culture, we focus so much on individual rights that we haven't done a good job of creating collective protection for things like pandemics, let alone climate change. Well, here goes the deep dive. I'm going to turn back and talk about the first time humanism as a word was used as a term. It actually isn't that old. The first time it was used was in 1836, and it was used by historians to refer to Renaissance scholars when they shifted from studying exclusively religious topics to emphasizing the humanities. In other words, human literature, human art, human culture, human language. The emphasis that humanist scholars put on secular topics evolved into what we know now as the Western canon. And it included writers from Homer and Plato and Virgil and St. Augustine, Erasmus, Cervantes, Shakespeare, Voltaire, many others. The 17th century use of the term humanism applied retroactively to Renaissance scholars who didn't use the term humanism themselves, but they did know that their approach to knowledge was radically different. They began to teach that we could learn about the world best, not through divine revelation, but by drawing on human creations, creations by mortal beings. And that was a revolutionary claim. Renaissance humanism emphasized our ability through observation and reason to learn about the world. One of the foremost scholars of humanism, Corliss Lamont, said that humanism was, quote, a revolt against the otherworldliness of medieval Christianity. One medieval Catholic priest, Erasmus, in fact, was called the first humanist. In some ways, he believed, he was a priest, he believed in God, but he also had faith in the innate capacity for self-improvement and cooperative intellectual growth. So early in the 1800s, when the term humanism was beginning to be used, it was used at that time in a way to reclaim the Renaissance, because in the early 1800s was when democracy was pushing back against autocracy, when monarchs were trying to hold on to power, but people were saying that individual human beings had this capacity. Tony Davies, who wrote a book simply titled Humanism, said that about 1800 was when the Enlightenment spirit was being channeled into liberation theology and used to promote democracy and to push back against autocracy. William Ellery Channing, who was a Unitarian minister, proclaimed in 1819 that human nature and reason could reveal religious truth. That's a new claim, that reason and human nature was enough to reveal religious truth. This was part and parcel of what Ralph Waldo Emerson was preaching in the early 1800s. He used poetry and prose to try to explain knowledge. He wrote, "Within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty." Transcendentalism, which was born about this time, proclaimed faith in human beings, in nature, in this world. And American religious humanism was born out of the poetry and the democratic spirit of the age. Now, some American liberal religious groups soon drifted away from poetry and embraced a naturalistic humanism of science. The British Humanist Religious Association was founded in 1853, and it was promoting, quote, knowledge of science, philosophy, and the arts. This was a time when Darwinism became the rage, and humanists saw their mission primarily as freeing human beings from superstition, from creationism. In the late 1800s, Robert Ingersoll, who is known as the Great Agnostic, epitomized a staunchly anti-supernatural humanism of liberation. Listen to what he said in the late 1800s. He said, Robert Ingersoll, "When I became convinced that the universe is natural, that all ghosts and gods are myths, there entered into my brain, into my soul, into every drop of blood, the sense, the feeling, the joy of freedom. The walls of my prison crumbled and fell. The dungeon was flooded with light, and all the bolts and bars and manacles became dust. I was no longer a servant, a serf, or a slave. There was for me no master in all the wide world, not even in infinite space. I was free to think, to express my thoughts, to live free of my own ideal, to free to live for myself and for those who I love, free to use all my faculties, all of my senses, free to spread imagination's wings, free to investigate, to guess, to dream and hope, free to judge and determine for myself. I was free. I stood erect and fearlessly and joyously faced all worlds." Now, that type of humanism over the last 150 years was embraced by many diverse thinkers like William James or John Dewey or Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, Erich Fromm, Jean-Paul Sartre, Walter Lippmann. And this embrace of liberation and the rejection of supernaturalism brought many humanists together. But it began to also split some religious communities. So I'm going to now turn to this question of the relationship between humanism and religion. It was in the late 1900s that I think the attempt to reconcile humanism and religion led to the founding of the Free Religious Association. This was a group that ended up in endless debates and only lasted about 2 decades, but the founder of Ethical Culture was the president of it for a little while, and it tried to to make sure that humanism and religion were tied together, but not every humanist wanted to have anything to do with religion. Within American Unitarian circles, there was a split occurring between East Coast American Unitarianism and Unitarianism of the West, which was at that point west of the Appalachians. The East was holding on to more Christian doctrine, and the West was pushing towards more humanist thinking. So Unitarian ministers like John Dietrich or Curtis Reese began preaching humanism before World War I. In 1933, there was the first Humanist Manifesto was declared. 33 humanist leaders, about half of them actually Unitarian Universalists, portrayed humanism as a new type of religion. And it proclaimed the universe as self-existing and natural, and said that religion and ethics flow out of human nature, not from some divine revelation. And whether identifying as secular humanists or religious humanists, humanists seem to share a lot of similar values in the early 1900s. In 1973, there was a second Humanist Manifesto that emphasized a lot of those values, but also emphasized the importance that human beings really rally around questions of environmental protection. It talked about the threat of nuclear war. It became aware in the 1970s how much humanists really had to work together to try to prevent the potential of us destroying ourselves. And I think had that humanism taken greater hold, we might have been better prepared for the pandemic that has swept over the United States now. Now, the second manifesto also in 1973 stressed non-theism as a term, which is a term many ethical culturists use, and secularism. And it said that both of those terms were quite often wrapped up in Americans' love of individualism, the humanism of the Enlightenment, and so on. But one element was missing, and that was the emphasis on community. And I'm going to come back to that emphasis on community in a minute. But let me look at one other debate within humanism large, the big tent, and that's whether we are religious or secular. There are some secular groups today, some humanist groups today that are purely secular and say that they don't want to have anything to do with religion. But let me look at the term secular, because this is where the confusion comes sometimes. It began in the Latin word meaning belonging to this age or of this world. It referred to the temporal, not the eternal. It referred to human beings, not the divine. But in Christianity, they used the term secular differently, because there were people who lived in the monastery who were called secular priests. And all that meant was that they left the monastery every once in a while to do good works in the world and to spread Christianity. So these secular priests used the word secular just to mean in the world of the everyday. It didn't mean it wasn't religious. But there is confusion between the term secular and religious. The Supreme Court in the 1961 ruling, Torcaso v. Watkins, ruled that secular humanism was a religion. So it was tying secular and religious together. Justice Hugo Black wrote in a footnote, quote, "Among religions in this country which do not teach what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of a God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others," end quote. So the Supreme Court talked about secular humanism as a religion. And many people in society today often are confused by secular and religion being tied together, because most people I talk to will say religion and secular are two independent things, that they are different, they're mutually exclusive. And the dictionary says this as well. The dictionary defines secular as, quote, "not having any connection with religion." And that's how I used the term secular for most of my life, actually just until a couple of years ago. But I'm warming up to the idea of using the term secular to describe ethical culture as well as the term religious. We're both. In fact, I think the term secular religion is a possible term to use. In some ways, this jives with Felix Adler, our founder, who said, We are religious to those who are religiously minded, and we're merely ethical for those who are not religiously minded. He didn't care whether we called it a religion or not, or whether we called it secular or not. So in some ways, I like the idea of calling ethical culture both secular, both religious, or calling it a secular religion. In fact, if you go into Wikipedia, there's an entire section called secular religion. Now, the problem with the Wikipedia entry is that it offers a very shallow interpretation of what secular religion is about. It talks about secular religion as being, for example, fascism or capitalism. And I think that's very shallow. It doesn't appreciate that there are secular religions like Buddhism or ethical culture. So I think that's a problem. But I do think the idea that we are both secular and religious makes sense. Our federating organization, the American Ethical Union, is affiliated with two openly secular organizations, the Secular Coalition for America, as well as a group called Open Secular. So we're linked with both religious and secular groups. One of the problems in our language is that Humanist International, which is a group that the American Ethical Union founded in 1952 when it was called the International Humanist and Ethical Union. It's now called Humanist International. It founded it, and it describes, the Humanist International, which we're a member of, describes humanism as a democratic and ethical life stance. Many of our members talk about it the same way. They say, yeah, ethical humanism or ethical culture, that's my life philosophy. In fact, most members of Humanist International understand that humanism had some religious roots back in the Unitarian days of the 1800s and on forward, but they actually don't understand why Americans still use the term religious humanism. Most humanists in Europe are totally secular and see religion as distinct from secularism. So one of the reasons why I wanted our members to go to Miami in August for the Humanist International Conference, that is also going to be when the American Ethical Union was going to have our meeting, we'll see now given the pandemic, I wanted us to get to know more European humanists who look at our embrace of the term religious as some weird tie to America's religious past. We can't get over it. So that, I think, is an interesting dynamic. Now I want to shift back to what I think makes our version of humanism, ethical humanism and ethical culture, what makes us most unique. So at this point, halfway through, I want people to wave your arms and wake up, get the blood running, because I could just have put a couple of you to sleep at this point. So I'm going to focus on two main characteristics that I think are what makes something a secular religion, or what makes us religious humanism. And the two are our commitment to community relationships and our commitment to action. Community relationships are supported by our congregational format. I mean, we're trying to meet together virtually right now because we believe coming together is important. And Felix Adler believed that as well, especially when he came to America, because he saw individualism running amok in our country. And he brought with him a culture from Reform Judaism of his family that emphasized the importance of relationships, the importance of being in a web of relationships. He accepted that we have a shared obligation to heal a broken world, the Reform Judaist value of tikkun olam. So he saw individualism and property rights as being so idolized in the United States that millions of people were left to starve because a few people were holding on to all the resources. Again, it makes me think that had we had a greater appreciation for the importance of community relationships, we might have had a better way to respond to the pandemic than we do today. Now, I'll admit, when I began at the Washington Ethical Society about 30 years ago as a member there, I felt my own cultural affinity to individualism made me resist a little bit the community emphasis of Washington. I resisted the groupism. I was asked to, hey, do you want to join a committee, or do you want to be involved in a service team? And I think I was fearful that I was being swallowed up, that my individualism was going to be subsumed by the community relationships. But I began to understand that at the Ethical Society, I was told I could be who I was. My individualism didn't have to go away, that in fact, my individualism was being reinforced by being a part of a group. My autonomy was enhanced by being a member of the Ethical Society. It wasn't negated by it. And I think that's a very important part. But getting together is necessarily important to deepen our relationships, to celebrate the seasons, to support each other through life's passages and through crises like the one we're in today. So while humanists may agree with the values of free thought, we also agree with the idea of civic responsibility. Universalist Unitarian minister Bill Murray, who died a couple of years ago, I thought said it very well. He said he compared secular humanism with religious humanism by saying religious humanism, quote, emphasizes the importance of communities that affirm, support, and encourage values through preaching, teaching, caring for one another, and deliberating life and life's passages together. Secular humanism does not. So while many secular humanists may get together, religious humanism talks about the importance of the congregational life that we've chosen to be together with each other. And that's the same thing that the courts ruled when they said ethical culture was to be counted legally as a religion, because it ruled that we did what other religions did. We gathered together and supported each other in a congregational format. Now, a lot of other humanist groups are seeing the importance of community much more than they did 30, 40 years ago. Greg Epstein, for example, who is at Harvard's Humanist Hub, is really, that's what he's all about, is getting together groups of people who are humanists, because in a group we can do more and we can support each other more. The American Humanist Association is emphasizing getting together much more than it did in a long time ago. I think in person and virtually, Roy Speckert, who's their executive director, is really emphasizing the importance of getting together. So I think that is what makes our type of humanism important, is that we're about coming together as a group while maintaining our individuality, balancing those two. Obviously, I think the other category is very important, and that is our emphasis on ethical action. Felix Adler saw ethics as important as the glue that holds the relationship between human beings together and establishes a flourishing community. He wrote actually that we had to learn how to create ethical relationships, not just between people, but between groups, between countries. And he said that was the biggest ethical challenge to human beings in modern times, is how do you establish ethical relationships that come naturally in families and in friends and in communities and neighborhoods? How do you recreate those on an international scale so we can work together as a world? After World War I, certainly, which was caused by inadequate transparency and communication and ethics between countries, one ethical culture leader, Alfred Martin, said that we had to have an ethicized conception of the state and its corollary, an ethics of citizenship. I think that in some ways is what's lacking from the current administration, a real ethical assumption of citizenship and an ethical conception of the state. Martin wrote in April 30th, 1922, that we need an ethicized nationalism to replace the narrow, nefarious, chauvinistic nationalism now rampant throughout the world. Boy, how that has come back to us today. Now, most of my time as an ethical culture leader, I saw our ethical connection as more essential to our identity and shared life than any rejection of supernaturalism in favor of evidence, reason, and science. In other words, I think the humanism of the 1800s and the early 1900s had to be one that said no to superstition and religion. But I think we're beyond that now, and now our humanism is focused on retaining reason and retaining the insistence on evidence and shared knowledge, but also how we act towards one another. That's what's most in need today. I do think that to a degree, humanism always had that seed of ethics from the very beginning. John Dietrich and Curtis Reach spoke of their faith being ethically focused way back in the 1920s. Fred Edwards, who's with the American Humanist Association, writes that humanism is a philosophy of compassion Human ethics is solely concerned with meeting human needs and human problems. So fundamental to humanism in general, but especially to ethical humanism, is the importance of how we work with one another now to answer our needs, to share, to be compassionate. One UU minister, Kenneth Pfeiffer, declared, quote, "Humanism teaches us that it is immoral to wait for God to act for us. We must act to stop the wars and the crimes and the brutality of this and future ages. We have the powers of a remarkable kind. We have a high degree of freedom in choosing what we'll do. Humanism tells us that whatever our philosophy of the universe may be, ultimately the responsibility for the kind of world in which we live rests with us." Modern humanism was primarily a tool to break free from the bondage of ancient faiths, as it was for Ingersoll. But in this last century, I think it's been less about liberation and more about responsibility. Had the world adopted humanist values more fully, I think we'd be more responsible now for dealing with this pandemic that's assaulting our species. I'm going to conclude now with just a couple of words about what ties all humanists together and with a warning about understanding humanism. Certainly, most humanists of the West, Western Europe, the United States, share a link to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment. But this Western-centric approach to humanism is also linked up with a lot of individualism and emphasis on property rights. It's linked to imperialism and conquest. And as we expand our awareness of what humanism can be, I think we should learn more from humanism in Asia, in Africa, and in indigenous cultures, because there is humanism there. And I think that'll help us develop a more universal appreciation of what humanism is. So when we proclaim our humanism, I think an important part of that is a degree of humility, because for too long, the Western world has claimed itself to be the sole owner of ethics and humanist values. And that's just not the case. You might remember when Mahatma Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization. You remember what he answered? He answered, "I think it would be a good idea." So I think for humanism, it would be a good idea to open our eyes and critique our tradition and look for humanism in other places of the world that focuses on the here and now, that focuses on ethics, but doesn't see itself as the sole arbiter of what humanism is all about. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Fred Edwards. Again, he was past president of the American Humanist Association. He said, religious humanism makes sure that doctrine is never allowed to subvert the higher purpose of meeting human needs in the here and now. This is why humanist child welcoming ceremonies are geared to the community, and humanist wedding services are tailored to the specialized needs of the wedding couple and their family. This is why humanist memorial services focus not on saving the soul of the dear departed, but on serving the survivors by giving them a memorable experience related to how the deceased was in life. Now, I presided over a number of memorial services, and in our current COVID crisis, inevitably I will be presiding over others. And what is most important to me is those memorial services feed the needs of the living and help us regain our values and our strength to serve each other in times of crisis. We are a philosophy that is about a love of life. That's a term that Fred Edwards used. Humanism is about a love of life. So when we take on our values and take them into the world and try to live by honoring the inherent worth of others, by building ethical relationships, and by building social justice, let us always remember that our love of life must keep us open to each other, open to learning, and open to reaching out to each other in dark times like this, even if it has to be across a platform like Zoom technology. I hope this worked for you. I hope this technology did not get in the way of the affection and warmth and love that I feel for everybody here today. I thank you for being with me today. And we'll continue our program and have a coffee hour soon. Thank you.